Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so they asked me to give a lecture on Bayesian optimization and hyperparameter search. I thought it's actually a great topic, but then I figured out that we also need a lot of background in order to do Bayesian optimization. So I'm going to go through a lot of material today, most of which you already know because you have been to Ulrich's lecture on Bayesian inference, I assume. And so, but before I want to go through all this material, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to what the kind of like problems are we are looking at in Bayesian optimization, and then we can cover the background, and then we come back to Bayesian optimization in the end. Here's also, I have some reading material for various sections, so you can look at the slides afterwards if you want to have some more background readings or tutorial papers and so on and so forth. Please read these papers. They are very good papers for learning about Bayesian optimization. Okay, so sometimes when you do experiments or when you want to solve problems, then solving problems may require you to invest a lot, and that could be money or time, for example. For example, if you look at finding optimal positions or locations for drilling for oil, then you may want to drill once or twice to figure out where this is, but moving the oil platform and so on and so forth is going to be expensive. Aisha was talking yesterday about looking at malaria, so malaria prevention, that was the research done by IBM, where they were discovering how much spray should we use, how many nets should we distribute, so what's the local optimum or global optimum in terms of like cost and effectiveness. But also drug design is something where you do not want to run too many experiments because they're very expensive, and actually want to do human experiments, then there are also some other issues involved. Yeah, so testing every kind of like setting here that is interesting may cost you a lot of time, may cost you a lot of money. So this is something we would like to prevent. But then many other problems that we have are in so-called machine learning meta challenges. So I think most of you have done some sort of like deep learning, and you probably know what I'm talking about. So machine learning models are getting more and more complicated, and they have more and more of these hyperparameters that we need to tune. And the optimization methods that we need are non-convex and stochastic, and this is very difficult to tune here, for example, the learning rates or momentum parameters. So finding these are kind of like hyperparameters of the methods that we use, and finding the right hyperparameters is very difficult. And in general, it's very hard to apply modern machine learning techniques and then to reproduce the results. So here's kind of like what we would like to have. We would like to automate the selection of these critical meta-parameters. So there's also a field that's called automated machine learning. If you search for this, you will find a lot of literature and examples of how to find or how to automate the entire pipeline from data to the production system in terms of like optimization at least. Okay, so here's an example. So you have a deep neural network. And once, if you manage to tune the neural network well, then you get really interesting results, really good results for many applications. So visual object identification, speech recognition, computation biology, and so on and so forth. But we have to do a lot of design choices. So the number of layers, the width of the layers, whether to use weight regularization, what kind of nonlinearities we use, the batch size, the learning rate schedule, the stopping conditions. All these kind of things are problems that we need to think about. So they have nothing, or many of them actually have nothing to do with the neural network itself, but a lot of them have to do with the optimization of the neural network parameters. So here's an example for DNA sequence classification. I think the details are not so important, but the idea was to predict which DNA sequences will bind with which proteins. And so the paper here by Miller et al. Proposed a method called latent structural support vector machine. How this entire thing works doesn't matter, but the important thing here is that you have also hyperparameters in the support vector machine, like the slack parameter or the margin parameter, There's also an entropy parameter or convergence criterion. So these are, again, meta parameters that we need to find. So they're not only in the deep neural networks, but they're also in other machine learning methods like the support vector machine. So these are the things we need to optimize. And so how do we do this? So normally we define an objective function to evaluate or to assess the quality of the hyperparameters, and we are normally interested in generalization performance. So that means how does my method work on a test set, not on the training set. Training set is not so interesting. So what often happens is cross-validation to measure the parameter quality, and cross-validation requires us to train our model many, many times. So that is tedious and takes a lot of time. So then how do we search? Well, I think manual tuning, I think everyone has done it. Like try a little bit bigger, you know, and maybe it works better. So let's say this requires expert knowledge. You could do grid search if you're on 1 or 2 dimensions. So you define a grid and try all these parameters on the grid. You can do random search, and so instead of defining a regular grid, you randomly sample in your space, and that actually works shockingly well. Or there's some sort of like magic involved that somebody comes and tells you, why don't you try learning rate of 0.001, and then you try it out and it works. You know, this is kind of the magic insight that sometimes happens. But ideally, this is nothing we would like to do because this doesn't work all the time. So the thing that's painful here is that evaluating the quality of the objective may be very expensive. So if we have to train a neural network for 2 weeks to get an answer, you know, we have to wait for 2 weeks. And additionally, we have also noisy observations. So the numbers that we get out are only noisy observations of an underlying function that we want to optimize. So some of the challenges that we face. So Bayesian optimization is an alternative method for optimizing these kind of hyperparameters. So the idea is to globally optimize a black box objective function. So black box means you pass parameters in, something happens inside which you don't know, and you observe the outcome. That's kind of like what happens in the neural network pipeline, right? You pass in a bunch of parameters, you wait for some time, and you observe or measure the quality of the parameters. So now here is the idea, really the key idea is to build a probabilistic proxy model for the objective function. Yeah, so you have like a few measurements of your objective for a bunch of parameters, and then you build a model like a regression function for the objective function, and then use this, this proxy model that you fit for finding the next parameter that you want to evaluate, or the next setting of your neural network. So that's the entire idea behind Bayesian optimization. So if you take this away from today, that's kind, right? So this is where we can start. So now the problem is, in order to talk a bit more about Bayesian optimization, we first have to talk about probabilistic regression. And that's where the kind of like the background comes in. But the good thing is, if we build a proxy model, let's think about linear regression. This proxy model is very cheap to evaluate, right? So you pass in a parameter and you evaluate the linear regression model. It takes like no time. This is really cheap to evaluate compared to waiting for 2 weeks for our GPU cluster to finish. Then we use the cheap proxy function to determine where to evaluate the true objective function next. So this is really the key idea of Bayesian optimization. So now the problem is that, well, not the problem, but a feature is that the standard proxy model in Bayesian optimization is something called a Gaussian process. So at some point today, we're going to talk about Gaussian processes for 2 minutes, just to get the high-level idea of what a Gaussian process does. But I'm going to spend the next maybe 20 to 30 minutes on a recap on linear regression. So if we get linear regression, the Gaussian process is just a small step further. And this is kind of like the overview of the next 20 to 30 minutes. So we're going to talk about linear regression, so maximum likelihood, very brief recap, map estimation, and then I want to spend much more time on Bayesian linear regression. And then slowly transition to the Gaussian process. I'm also just seeing I'm using the wrong PDF viewer, but I'll fix this later. Oh yeah, so we're going to do a crash course on linear regression. So most of the things that I'm going to talk about are also in this book, which you can download for free from this URL. Shameless plug. So if you find mistakes, you can raise a GitHub issue and then we'll fix it. All right. So here's the thing I want to solve: a regression problem or curve fitting. So we have some inputs x and corresponding observations y of an underlying function f, and f models the relationship between x and y. So assume we have x values here, we have observed function values here, so these blue dots. Then we would like to find a function that explains the creation of these blue dots. So typically we parameterize the function with some parameters theta, and linear regression is just a case where the function is linear in the parameters. So that does not necessarily mean that the function is a straight line, but it's a linear combination of features, and these features could be nonlinear. I'm going to give you examples in a moment. So here is an example of a straight line. So y could be f of x and theta, so theta 0 plus theta 1 times x. We can also write it like this in this inner product notation. And this is an example of a function that we can model using this kind of parameterization. But we can also describe polynomials, which we can also write as a linear combination of features. So now these features are nonlinear, and we can write them as vector 1 to x to the power of m. So this is an mth order polynomial that also falls into the class of linear regression models, because it is linear in the parameters. It's not, doesn't have to be linear in the x values, but it is linear in the parameters. And that makes our life easy when we optimize these theta parameters. And an example function that we can model is this polynomial here. We can also do some other things. We can use other basis functions. So this one is a radial basis function network. Again, it's a linear in the parameter. It's a linear combination of basis functions which has a Gaussian or bell-shaped curve. And that would be an example function that we can describe using this kind of like linear regression method. So I'm going to look at this example here. So y is x transpose times theta. So this is kind of like this setting here. Plus epsilon. So epsilon is kind of like a Gaussian distributed noise. And so now given a training set x1, y1, so these pairs of xi, yi, we want to find optimal parameters theta star. Yeah? So now, and we're going to look at two ways to get this. We're going to look at maximum likelihood estimation and maximum a posteriori estimation. So now, also, if this is, at some point, if you have a question or if you think I'm talking rubbish, then just please let me know, raise your hand, ask questions. Because otherwise we're not going to need 30 minutes for this. So please, yeah, make this interactive. Okay, so we're going to define a matrix X which collects all our training inputs, x1 to xn, and a vector Y which collects all the function values, or observed function values, so these noise-corrupted function values in a vector. And we want to find parameters theta star that maximize the likelihood. So now coming back to Ulrich's lecture from Sunday, we can write down the likelihood, which is the probability density of the observations given the inputs and the parameters. We can also write it like this, P of y given x and theta. And we make a factorization assumption that we have IID data. So we now plug in the distribution of a particular observation given the input and the parameters. So the mean of this is xn transpose times theta, and the uncertainty is given by the variance of the noise parameter, so the noise that corrupts our function values. So this is the quantity that we want to maximize, so maximum likelihood. So we write down the likelihood, now we maximize the likelihood. So one of the tricks that we do is maximizing the likelihood is equivalent to maximizing the log likelihood. Yeah, we can do a log transformation and the optimum does not change, but it makes our problem easier. So if you write down the log likelihood now, so the product turns into a sum, and we move the log in, so we just have the sum of log Gaussian distributions, and the log Gaussian distribution looks like this, so it's 1 over 2 sigma squared, minus 1 over 2 sigma squared, and then we have this term here, which is yn minus xn transpose times theta squared, and we have a constant here that is independent of theta. So we want to maximize with respect to theta, so we can ignore that constant. So effectively what the log likelihood is a squared penalty on the deviation of the observed function values and the mean prediction with our current parameter setting. So if you know least squares regression, it's exactly the same as least squares regression, just writing down this as a log likelihood optimization problem. So how do we optimize? Well, we compute the gradients with respect to the parameters we're interested in. We set the gradient to 0, and then the maximum likelihood estimator is given by this equation here. Yeah, so gradients we've done on Sunday as well with Karim, and then this is the maximum likelihood estimator. If you take this, the log likelihood, compute the derivative with respect to theta, set it to 0, you get a closed form answer which looks like this. So now we can fit functions, and for an arbitrary input now we can also predict the output, so the corresponding y value, and we can do this by simply using the maximum likelihood estimator in our equation that describes the relationship between x and y. So then our predictive distribution would be, has a Gaussian distribution because it's still noise corrupted, so we have that variance sitting here. And our mean value, mean prediction would be x star transpose times the maximum likelihood estimator. So this is how we can make make predictions at points that we have not seen before. So if I'm given this kind of data set here, then I can now fit a straight line. So my model is this one here, or my relationship between x and y is, so y is theta 0 plus theta 1x plus epsilon. So I can fit straight lines, and there's some noise disturbance in here. And what I'm plotting here is just the mean prediction. So I'm only writing down theta 0 of the maximum likelihood estimator plus theta 1 times the of the maximum likelihood estimator times x star. So this is the line I'm drawing here. And that one looks like a reasonable fit if I constrain myself to straight lines. Now, we can also fit nonlinear functions. So now we go back to these basis functions that we talked about earlier. I can now write down y is phi transpose times theta, and phi I choose now in this way here that I can fit mth order polynomials. Yeah, so these are monomials at degree 0, 1, 2, up to m. And then I do a linear combination of these monomials, and I can fit polynomials of up to degree m. So now I get the maximum likelihood estimator in exactly the same way that I did before. I write down the log likelihood, I take the derivative with respect to theta, and I optimize, and I get a maximum likelihood estimator that looks like this. So if you take the old maximum likelihood estimator and replace x with the phi matrix, so phi collects now all the features evaluated at the training points, then you get this answer. So now we can also do polynomial regression. So we use the same data set that I had before, and we can now fit a second order polynomial. So that looks kind of reasonable, or a fourth order polynomial, so that looks maybe better, or sixth order polynomial, And now the deep learning people are happy, right? Because we hit every data point here. Yeah, so 8th order polynomial hits every data point really nicely. So what's the problem here? So overfitting. What is overfitting? It looks strange, right? So why does it look strange?
Yeah, like very close to one data set. You are not learning. It's not so memorizing according to the data set.
Okay, it's very close to the data set, okay.
It's also a generalization.
It's not a generalization. Let's say it's a bad generalization.
Yes.
Okay.
You can make specific tasks, but then
Okay, so this is all going in the same direction. So one of the problems that we have in our data set is that we have noise. Right? And when we overfit, we find signal in the noise. We believe that the noise is part of the signal, right? And that's the reason why this thing looks so strange. Because the true function is, I think, is a sine wave. So something like this actually makes a lot of sense, but I added a lot of noise in order to make sure that we get some overfitting. Yeah? And then, if you go to higher orders, then things go completely nuts. So, and this is kind of like a graph that you actually want to look at. Yes, is there a question?
Yes, I want to know about the noise we generate when we get it into the... Can we generate the noise to have something good?
So you want to generate noise in order to...
It's something good, because you see, you're having 3 iterations of the same picture, living from the sine wave, and then you added slightly a bit of noise, and you added much more noise so that you can fit it in place. So can we have a good function of noise?
So can we have a good?
A good function, something that can be good out of noise. Out of the noise, we put a function on.
Right, so you can use noise in some sense to regularize your method. Right, so you can add noisy versions of your data set in order to maybe regularize your method. That's possible, but you're working with neural networks, right? Okay. Yeah. So if you yes, I think this is people do this, especially when you have images, right? You can do data augmentation. You can try to effectively it's a regularization because you have so many parameters in your neural network. You have many more parameters than you have data points. And that means you have in some sense, like an over-parameterized model. And you need to kind of like tell these parameters what to do. And so if you add noise in that sense, they say it's like, oh, okay, don't overfit too much to this one thing because you have conflicting function values if you want to talk about this in a regression setting for the same input.
Isn't the problem the fact that there are too many degrees of freedom? Because even if we didn't add noise, we still have some of the parameters of the polynomial that we set to some value.
Yeah. So the question is like, do we have too many degrees of freedom? So do we have too many parameters? Yes. So one way to let's say solve our overfitting problem is to restrict the class of functions that we consider. So if we just look at straight lines, there is no overfitting that we can do. But if we have only 6, 8, 10 data points and we're going for like a 10th order polynomial, then there's too much freedom. If there wasn't any noise, maybe that would actually work. But there is noise in the data, and then you start finding signal in the noise because you minimize the squared distance between your noisy function values and what the mean of your model actually predicts. Okay, so what we get if you actually look at the training error, so if you evaluate your loss function, in this case the log likelihood, so actually we're looking here, so I'm plotting the RMSE, root mean squared error here. So that only looks at the squared loss, and the log likelihood is something that is a multiple of this, is the 1 over 2 sigma squared. So, but this is the key thing. So if you increase the flexibility or the model flexibility of your model class or the degree of the polynomial, you can see that the training error goes down. And at some point you hit 0 or something that's very close to 0. But if you're interested in the performance of your model on data that you have not seen, then you want to look at test error. And so the test error initially also goes down because you have an underparameterized model in the beginning with these straight lines. But at some point, this test error skyrockets. And this is a very good indicator for overfitting. So if you have these kind of like curves, you would probably choose a 4th or 5th order polynomial because that gives you the best generalization performance. And you will not get down to a test error of 0 because you have noisy data. So in this example, 4 or 5 is a good choice for this polynomial. So now, so we're not interested in the training error. The training error is an indicator, but actually a bad indicator at some point. We're interested in the generalization performance, which tells us how the model performs on data sets that we have not seen. And as you already said, maximum likelihood runs into overfitting problems. So one of the things we could do is we can, I think, going a little bit in your direction, we have a lot of parameters. Why don't we punish these parameters in some way? So we can regularize these parameters, or in a Bayesian setting, we can put a prior distribution on the parameters. So what you often observe is that in parametric models, if you start overfitting, then these parameters go pretty wild in terms of like amplitudes. You have very large values and very large negative values. So one way to restrict or kind of like tell these parameters they shouldn't go too far away from 0 is to put a prior distribution on those parameters. And so every time you go kind of like in the tails of the prior distribution, you get a pretty large penalty. And so this is one way to penalize extreme values that are implausible under the prior distribution. And so now, the idea now is to choose the theta or find theta star parameters not as parameters that maximize the likelihood, but that maximize the log posterior distribution on the parameters. And this is what Ulrich derived this week earlier. So the log posterior distribution is the log likelihood. So this is a term we already have. This is squared penalty on the deviation between y and theta transpose times x, plus the log prior distribution, plus a constant. So a constant is the log marginal likelihood, but it's independent of the parameters. So now if you choose a Gaussian prior, then this will be a squared penalty on the parameters. And that is where you get regularized least squares. So it's just like either you can change the loss function, you add a quadratic penalty to the parameters, or you can write it down as this Bayesian model where you optimize or maximize the log posterior distribution, you get the same answer. Yeah, so the log prior induces this direct penalty on the parameters or on the amplitude of the parameters in the hope that we address this issue of extreme values. And you get a map estimate or regularized least squares estimate, which looks very similar to our maximum likelihood estimate, but it has this additional term in here, which is exactly the lambda regularizer that you would have in least squares, in regularized least squares. And this lambda parameter is the ratio of the noise variance and the variance of your prior distribution if you choose Gaussian distribution with mean 0 and variance alpha squared times I. So again, this is just, if you want to read up on this more, there is lots of material. The point I wanted to get from here is that if we draw these kind of like the same polynomials and now draw a map estimate and the maximum likelihood estimate, you can see that we can, these curves are a little bit smoother than the blue ones, which are the maximum likelihood estimates, but it doesn't really solve our problem. So if we go to 8th order or 10th order polynomial, we still have problems here. It is smoother in some ways, but map estimation, or regularization in this case, doesn't really solve our problem. Yeah? And if we now draw the same curves that we had earlier, so test and training error, then we can see that map estimation is a bit more stable for a little bit longer, and then it starts overfitting. So map estimation doesn't solve the overfitting problem. It kind of, in some way, it delays the problem of overfitting, but it doesn't solve it. And that means we need a more principled solution to overfitting than map estimation. And that's kind of like where Bayesian linear regression comes into play. So we're going to look again at the same model that we had before, y equals phi transpose times theta plus epsilon. And now instead of like finding point estimates, so finding one parameter set that maximizes our likelihood or our posterior, we just refuse to fit anything. And what the Bayesian now would say is, well, we integrate out the parameters. So we place a prior distribution on the parameters, compute a posterior distribution, and when we make predictions, we integrate out with respect to this posterior distribution. And that will change a few things. So this is kind of like the idea, right? So we want to use a full parameter distribution, so instead of a single parameter, when making predictions. So what we now want to compute is we want to compute the distribution of our function values given an input value. And note there is no theta left anymore here. So how do we do this? Well, we use the kind of like, this is kind of like the likelihood, right? So this is the predictive distribution if you just use one specific parameter. And then we have this prior distribution on the parameters and integrate this out. So it's kind of like an average of the predictions that we would get with a maximum likelihood estimator or with a map estimator, depending on what this is. So this is an average over plausible predictions. You can think of it as this. Yeah? And so the nice thing now, the predictive distribution also reflects the uncertainty about the correct parameter settings. So if you are really certain about one parameter, then this distribution just converges to like a delta, a direct delta, so only 1 point left, and then that would be equivalent to using a single parameter. But if this is not a delta function, then this predictive distribution will reflect something about the uncertainty in the parameters. We're going to have a look at this in a moment. So here's an example where I used the, I think, one of the higher order polynomials that we had earlier. And I'm plotting the, sorry, it's a bit difficult to see. I'm having the map estimate, again, in the orange curve, the maximum likelihood in the gray curve. And now Bayesian linear regression is all this gray shaded stuff. So that's now the predictive distribution. If you take a single slice out here, you would have a Gaussian distribution, and the mean would be identical to the map estimate. But then you also have a lot of uncertainty floating around, and most of the uncertainty comes from the posterior distribution over the parameters. So I try to highlight how much noise contribution there is. So if you look carefully, or if you look later at the slides, you'll see there's a shaded, light gray shaded area. That's the noise distribution, but this is only a little bit here. And everything else, all the other uncertainty comes straight from the distribution on the parameters. So most of this uncertainty is parameter uncertainty, or because of the parameter uncertainty. On the right side, I'm plotting functions which are plausible under the posterior distribution on the parameters. So I generate these functions by sampling one parameter vector from the posterior distribution, and then do a normal prediction that I did, like in the same way that I did maximum likelihood prediction or map prediction, by just plugging in this value into theta transpose times x, and I draw this corresponding line. You can see that all of these functions are plausible under that distribution, and you can see a lot of variability in this. So the Bayesian linear regression effectively says that, in this area over here, I'm relatively confident I know what's going on, but here, we are very uncertain. So now, if you want to build a product and you need to make a decision based on, you know, these kind of predictions, it may be useful to take this uncertainty into account. Yeah? Then you can compute risk, right? So you compute expected return or expected losses instead of telling your customer or yourself that, you know, I really believe that this orange line is the right thing to do. If you take this posterior distribution or you know, all these functions into account in some weighted way, then I think you would be much more robust to problems that you otherwise have with the model. Okay, so yeah, so that's kind of like what I just said. So here is the model for Bayesian linear regression. So in our setting, we're going to put a Gaussian prior on the parameters with some mean and some covariance matrix. The likelihood is the same that we had before. So P of y given x and theta is Gaussian distributed with, let's say, for the time being, assume sigma squared is known, so that's the variance of the noise, and this one would be the mean. Now, in the, yes?
Can we have another distribution which is not Gaussian?
Okay, so good question. So can we choose a distribution which is not Gaussian as the prior distribution? Of course you can choose this. You can choose a different distribution, but then you can't do the maths anymore. So you can choose a different distribution. You can use uniform distribution or whatever, and nothing works anymore. So this is the exactly one case where you can do the maths in closed form, where you have a Gaussian prior and a Gaussian likelihood. If you change the likelihood, same problem. So Ulrich mentioned this on Sunday as well, where he said, you know, we have outliers, so we maybe want to think about a t-distribution, and then you have to go into MCMC or variational inference. So this is the one example, the only one example where you can do maths in closed form. So I say that again?
You said it's only Gaussian that the math works out, right? So only Gaussian, or can you choose anything else from the exponential family distribution?
Okay, so the question is, could I choose anything from the exponential family distribution? So you need a conjugate prior. So if you have a Gaussian likelihood, the conjugate prior is the Gaussian. If you have a different likelihood, then you have a different conjugate prior. So in these conjugate models, so you need, if you want to do closed form inference, you need a conjugate model. And so if you have but in the case of the Gaussian likelihood, then there's only one answer to this, which is the Gaussian prior.
But even if you have a conjugate prior, that would just mean that the posterior is known. But when we integrate over the posterior, we still might have issues, right?
So when we have a conjugate prior, then we know that the posterior is of the same form as the prior, and we can actually compute the moments or the sufficient statistics of the posterior distribution. And if we have the posterior distribution, I think we should be able to do closed form predictions. So it's getting a bit complicated now in this regression setting, right? So in the
The likelihood is when we are trying to predict something is still more than the posterior, right? So if you integrate that over, it should work.
So if you can compute the posterior distribution, you can also compute the marginal likelihood. So that's I think it's more or less the same problem. And if you can compute the marginal likelihood, you can also do predictions. So marginal likelihood and a predictive distribution are the same thing, except that you either integrate out the prior or the posterior. So you should be able to do closed form predictions within conjugate families. Okay. Right. So yeah, we kind of like said that the prior needs to be needs to be conjugate to the likelihood, which allows us to do closed form computations. Now, I'm just going to put this on the slide. We're not going to derive this. Now I'm going to blame Ulrich again because he did this on Sunday. But just to make sure that we have it on the slide, the posterior distribution on the parameters we're interested in is Gaussian, has this variance and has this mean independent. Let's not go into the details here. Important point is that the mean is actually identical to the map estimate. So if you know the map estimate, you already computed the mean of your Bayesian posterior distribution. And if you have this Gaussian prior distribution, so this one here, then we can make a prediction of the y value. So this now we're going to get into this business where I showed you these error bars, and this is how I computed them. So now the mean is the same as the map, or the mean that we would compute with the map estimate, but now the variance is different. So the predictive distribution using the map and also the maximum likelihood estimate only had this sigma squared, which comes from the noise, but now we have this additional term here. And this additional term tells you how much of the uncertainty from your distribution over the parameters propagates through to your predictive distribution of the function value. So this term here is the influence of the distribution of the parameter uncertainty. If your variance, if your posterior is very peaked, so the variance goes to 0, this term goes away and we are identical to the map estimate. But if you have a lot of uncertainty here, so the Sn is big, this is a quadratic form, so this is non-negative, then this entire thing really goes very big. Yeah, so this term here is contribution to the predictive variance only because of the parameter uncertainty. Yeah, this yellow term here. And again, if you want to have some more details on Bayesian linear regression, then please have a look at chapter 9 in that in the book. Okay, so now I need to switch PDF viewers. Now I just want to visualize an example. We're going to look at a very simple problem, right? So we're looking at y equals f of x plus epsilon, and now I'm going to choose f of x just to be a straight line, a plus b times x. That means, and we have some noise on here. Now, the parameters that I don't know are a and b, right? So the offset from 0 and the slope. And now I'm going to put a Gaussian prior on these parameters, so we have a two-dimensional parameter space, and I'm going to visualize this parameter space here, and this is our contour plot of the prior distribution that we chose. So now I can now sample from this distribution, and sample means I'm going to choose one point from this Gaussian distribution. So this one point corresponds to one value of A and one particular value of B. So if I now use this kind of like AI and BI, so the coordinates of this point, then I can plug them in here. For x values between -10 and +10, I'm going to get this line out of here. Yeah, so the slope is slightly negative, so this is the B value, and A is slightly positive, I think. Anyways, that line corresponds to this particular realization of the parameters. So if I now repeat this, I'm going to draw more points from this distribution, and every point will kind of like generate or allow me to generate one of these functions. Yeah, so I'm going to repeat this again. So the orange point corresponds to the orange line here. And I can do this more and more often. So you I can see that the functions are not quite all over the place because we discourage like huge offsets and huge slopes. But you I can see that there are a lot of functions that make sense under under this prior distribution. Now, if I have now a training set. Yeah, so this is now a training set, and kind of like a straight line makes a lot of sense if we have noise in the data. So I can compute this posterior distribution. So I wrote down the equations earlier on the slides. So Mn and Sn I can compute, and my posterior distributions now on my two parameters is now this kind of like Gaussian distribution, which is focused or centered around a value of A, which is maybe between -1 and -0.5, and B is around 0.5. So I can do the same game here. I can sample now from this posterior distribution and generate the corresponding lines. And now you can see that because the posterior distribution is more concentrated, there are only few parameters that actually make sense. And all of these lines kind of make sense in terms of like fitting. So none of these lines is a really bad fit. So what I wanted to kind of like convey here is that we can think of this now, instead of distribution over parameters, we can think of this now directly as a distribution over functions, because every parameter generates one function, and if I have many parameters, I have many functions, so I can think of this as a distribution over functions instead of distributions over parameters that make sense. We can also now fit nonlinear functions, and we already know this, so we saw basis functions earlier. So this is the radial basis function network that we had in the beginning, and these are like example basis functions that I'm spreading out here between -5 and +3. I'm going to choose now in this model, I choose 25 basis functions, which are all with centers between -5 and +3. And then I am given, so these are now samples from my prior distribution over the parameters. So again, I choose a Gaussian prior on these parameters, do a linear combination of these basis functions. And now this is, these are example functions that I can generate using this RBF model or RBF network. And in the same manner that we did or used earlier, we compute the posterior distribution for a given training set. So I use a sine wave here to generate this data set. I can compute a posterior distribution on the parameters and now generate these functions in the same way that we generated these straight lines. Sample from the posterior distribution, plot the corresponding function. Now, I'm going to now do this, let's say, infinitely often, and I'm just going to represent this entire distribution over functions using this shaded area. So shaded area says around the mean, which is here in the middle, the red line, 95% of my function values are going to be within this shaded area. What's the problem with this model? Everyone happy with this? Why are you not happy?
It doesn't learn anything periodic about the functions.
Okay, so that's a good point. So there's nothing periodic about the function. It also did not. So, okay, so it's not performing well in some part. Which part? This part here? You're doing deep learning, right? Okay, good. So there's sorry.
You somewhat arbitrarily chose 25 basis functions, but maybe more.
Okay, how many would you choose?
An infinite number.
How do you implement this? All right. So okay. So there are two very good points. Here's the observation that we're not doing very well over here, and I believe you're uncomfortable because we have a lot of uncertainty here. And then there is the point from over there, we don't have enough basis functions, so our model is not flexible enough. Well, so now I could counter-argue there that I'm happily fitting my training data. I don't need a more flexible model. But I'm going to come back to this. Anyone else who thinks you know, yeah, but you know, it's good to be confident. All right, so now this is now two interesting observations. So one is, right, so one observation is like, I don't know anything about here, so I'm very uncertain about this. And the other one is, I'm too certain about here. So I believe your suggestion is we should copy this and also put it on this side. So the thing here is, yes, we are very uncertain about what's going on. The problem is we don't have data in this area, so we should be uncertain about what's going on. And so that's exactly the problem that we have here. So in the absence of data, this model is going to predict 0. Now the question is, would you bet money on this, that the function continues like this? The model would, because it's very certain. Whereas here is like, it says like, okay, I'm going to predict also 0, but actually it's like, I don't know what's going on. So this part is the problem. So you predict something with unjustified confidence, and this one is maybe a problem in the sense that you don't know what's going on, but at least you know that you are uncertain. So that's the important point to take away from here. Maybe unfortunate, but the right side is bad.
Can we use a model like this in
At 5, and then you can say, well, I can't do this. That's what you can say. We don't have enough data. Therefore, you can still make a prediction, but then you can say, you know, I don't really know what's going on. So you can still make a prediction, but you also tell the customer and say, you know, I don't really have much data in this area. Therefore, you're going to get a lot of answer. I'm not going to give you one prediction, but I'm going to give you a predictive distribution, which says, you know, for example, here I'm predicting 0, but you know, plus minus 2 with 95% confidence. Right? So you can. Don't give people a number, give them a distribution. They can deal with the distribution. Okay, so what can we do? So feature engineering. So this is now we can say we want to model periodic functions. We can use features that are periodic, and then we can model this actually very nicely. Point over there is the finite number of features is a problem, and the reason why we have this confident prediction here is that we don't have basis functions in this area. So, and that means we cannot express any variability of the function, and as you said, ideally we would like to add infinitely many features and then spread all over our domain. Then we then we get these error bars everywhere. So that's a good point because that's our approach. So now we want to place infinitely many features everywhere. So, and now we need to come back to this kind of like thinking about like distributions over functions. So instead of like sampling now these parameters which induce this distribution over functions, why don't we just sample functions directly? And in order to do this, right, we use the sample from a distribution over parameters. Now, in this, if we want to do this, let's place a prior distribution directly on functions. And in order to do this, we need to make some assumptions about the distribution over functions. So now this is getting a bit strange because functions are these very unwieldy objects. But you know, intuitively you can think of a function as an infinitely long vector. And we know how to deal with vectors. We can place distributions on vectors. And that kind of like allows us to make assumptions on the distribution of function values. And so one of the most convenient distributions that we have for vectors is the Gaussian distribution, right? So this is kind of the thing that we use all the time. And so this will lead us exactly to what a Gaussian process is. So the Gaussian process is a distribution over functions with infinitely many basis functions. And I'm going to give you a 2-slide introduction to Gaussian processes with almost no equations. So if you want to read more on Gaussian processes, there is this book, Gaussian Processes for Machine Learning, which you can also download. PDF is available. There is also a Gaussian process summer school, so similar to the Indaba, deep learning Indaba, there's a Gaussian process summer school, so 2 or 3 days just on Gaussian processes. There's also a really nice video lecture by Richard Turner, so I'll make the slides available so you don't have to write it down, or if you want to take a picture, it's fine. The video lecture is actually very, very nice. So, here's what a Gaussian process is, more or less high level. So it's like an extension of the Bayesian linear regression setting that we had earlier, super flexible, implements a probability distribution over functions and is specified by a mean function and a covariance function. So instead of like a mean vector and a covariance matrix, now we talk about mean functions and covariance functions. So the mean function is kind of like the average function under the distribution, which could correspond to, for example, this line here, which is the average under the distribution. And the covariance function allows us to encode high-level structural assumptions such as differentiability or periodicity on the class of functions that we want to model. So nice thing is that we can do Bayesian inference in closed form, and we can make, again, predictions similar to the Bayesian linear regression setting in closed form, and our predictive function values are also Gaussian distributed, not because it's a Gaussian process, but because of the Gaussian likelihood that we chose, and the mean and the variance depend on the corresponding input, and we can compute them in closed form. Equations are irrelevant here. And here's a picture of like how it works. We place a prior distribution over functions, and this is kind of like a representation of this prior distribution. We have a prior mean function, which is flat 0 because there's no evidence that it should be positive or negative. There's no preference for being positive or negative. So on average, 0, so that's what it expresses. And then the uncertainty, again, like we believe that under the prior distribution here, most of the function values are within the 95%, within this shaded area. So 95% of the function values we believe are in this shaded area, and additionally we make some smoothness assumption. So if we sample now from this Gaussian process, each sample corresponds to one function, so similar to earlier, and these are the functions which are representative for this prior distribution. So if you now look at the expected value, the expected function value, so that's the mean function evaluated at the corresponding inputs here, we set is 0, so it's currently 0 in this equation, and then the uncertainty is this, let's say, the green term. That's the prior variance for each function value. Now, we can start observing a data point, and what the Gaussian process now does, it changes. It changes in two ways. So now the mean function goes through this data point. So I assume noise-free observations, because it illustrates the point. It goes through this data point. So if you look at the equation, ballpark, it's no longer 0, so there's an equation now, and the equation expresses how I can compute this black line. And then the variance shrinks, so the uncertainty shrinks. So what it says is, around this observation, I'm much more confident making a prediction. And so this is now expressed by this expression here. So we still have the green term, so that was our prior variance, and we subtract something which is non-negative. And the non-negative part expresses how much information I can transfer from this function value to other function values. Yeah? And if I go far away from the input here, then this term will go to 0. So I'm going to fall back to the prior distribution, and that will solve our problems with these finitely many basis functions that we had earlier in the RBF network. So we can now continue observing function values, and you can see that a Gaussian process adapts. And if we now sample from this posterior distribution, these sampled functions are, they are in agreement kind of like in this area where we have a lot of observations, but they disagree if we go away from the data. And that's exactly what we want. It's a thing that tells us that if there's no data, that we don't really know what's happening there. And that's why these functions are very in much disagreement in this area. So that's the 2-slide introduction to Gaussian processes. And now we have 30 minutes for Bayesian optimization. So I need you to just to understand that a Gaussian process gives you these variances. I think that's kind of like the key idea or key thing that you should take away from here. I gave you a bit more information than that, but we're getting there. So now let's have a look at Bayesian optimization with Gaussian processes. So remember, we want to find a solution to an optimization problem of an expensive to evaluate black box function. So here's a setting. We want to find a global minimum of an objective function g. So x star is the argument of g of x. And we can evaluate the objective function pointwise. So we can plug in x, but there's no functional form that tells us how we get from x to g of x. And on top of this, the observations may be noisy. The practical challenge here is that evaluating g is costly. So let's say if I were to optimize this function, so normally if you want to do gradient descent, you evaluate your function, compute the gradient, and then do a small step, you evaluate again and again and again and again. So if you have to pay $10 for every time you evaluate the function, you think twice whether you really want to evaluate that function. So that's kind of like the challenge that we are facing. So, and again, so to evaluate, or to avoid evaluating this expensive function an excessive number of times, we use an approximation or a proxy to this function. We're going to call this g tilde, and this g tilde is going to be a Gaussian process. Now, ideally, kind of like find a global optimum of g tilde, so, and then hope that g tilde is similar to g, and then you are back in business, right? So you can, then you solve your problem. And then you can evaluate your true objective g at this optimizer of g tilde, and overall you have evaluated your expensive function once in this pipeline at least. So that's kind of like the idea. And that works well if g tilde and g are very close. And so, but that's usually not the case, and that means you have to repeat this cycle. So if you get an evaluation of g here, then you add this to your training data set for the Gaussian process, you update your model, and then you run through this pipeline again. So that's the idea of like how Bayesian optimization works. So here's an illustration of how this works. Assume we want to minimize the blue function. So I'm just drawing this here to make sure that we kind of like know what the right answer is, but we actually don't know what the blue function is. The only thing that we know is we have evaluated the blue function once and got this value here. So now with this one data point, we build a Gaussian process model. Now we're going to evaluate the Gaussian process model where the gray shaded area is minimum. So I'm going to explain this in more detail a bit later. So the Gaussian process model tells us to evaluate at theta equals -5. So now we're going to pay our $10 again, and I get this function value here. So now Gaussian process has updated. I'm going again and choose the place where the shaded area is minimum. And I get now this value here, theta equals 5. Okay, pay my $10. I get another function value observation. And so we can continue. And, now we have kind of like a reasonable idea of like what the blue function looks like. Now we have a better idea. And at some point, we have a very good idea of what the blue function looks like at the point where the minimum is. So key point is very, and that's important. So we're not interested in having a very good model in areas where we're not interested in. So we found a good model. So we found the optimizer in less than 10 evaluations of this function, and keep also in mind that we started here. So if you want to do simulated annealing or anything else, then I think it will be very hard to get over this bump. Bayesian optimization solves this in a different way, this kind of exploration problem. We're going to get into some of the details later. So now actually, how do we choose the next point that we want to evaluate our true function at? And that is something that the acquisition function does. An acquisition function tells us where to evaluate next. And if you remember also earlier, I said, we minimize the Gaussian process. So this is kind of a weird thing because a Gaussian process is a distribution. So how do we minimize a distribution? So this is a bit strange, but the acquisition function is actually what we optimize. And the acquisition function takes in the distribution and spits out a deterministic value. So, but one of the key things that the acquisition function does, or also the Bayesian optimization needs, is we want to do global optimization, and therefore we can use the uncertainty of the Gaussian process to get out of local optima and to drive exploration of our function, targeted exploration. So we want to extrapolate from collected knowledge, and what the Gaussian process gives is closed form means and variances. So what we now need to do is we need to find a trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So it's similar to what, if you have done reinforcement learning, you have heard of this. But exploration is like we want to learn more about the underlying function, independent of whether it's good or bad. We want to learn more about the function. In this case, we are looking for places where we're very uncertain, for example, over here. But if we want to exploit, we want to exploit our current knowledge, and that means we would look at places where our Gaussian process has low mean. So for example, in this area here, that would be a good place to exploit. And the acquisition function trades these things off. Yeah. So I'm going to write alpha for the acquisition function, but really one of the key things that the acquisition function does is it trades off these kind of like conflicting objectives of exploration and exploitation. And here's kind of like now more detailed the pseudocode for Bayesian optimization. So assume you have an initial data set that may be only one data point, so one input and one observation of your function that you want to optimize. Then you train your Gaussian process on this data set. You select the next input that you want to query your function at, your true function at, by maximizing the acquisition function. Then you query your true function, and then you just augment your data set that you have for the Gaussian process using the input that you chose and the observation that you get. Question?
So this rests on the assumption that the mean and the variance defined by the are somewhat compatible with the two objective functions that we're trying to optimize.
Yes. Okay, so that's a good question. So the question is, let me rephrase this a little bit. We rely on the assumption that the Gaussian process can actually model the underlying function. So that is true. And there are maybe objective functions with nasty discontinuities. And then, you would get a smooth interpolation depending on what kind of kernel or covariance function you choose. You would get an interpolation. I think the key point is, let's say, hopefully, your optimum is not quite at the jump where you have the discontinuity, and then your model would be hopefully good again in areas where the actual true optimum is. So if your Gaussian process is a good approximation of your true function in the area or vicinity of your true local optimum, I think you may be in good shape. Now, you could come with an argument that a Gaussian process is a universal function approximator, but that is true in the limit of like infinitely many data points, which you can't afford if you have to pay $10 every time there are bounds on like how close the Gaussian process is to the true function. But I mean, in general, you are right. So if we cannot model the true underlying function well with a Gaussian process, then this will break eventually. But you can do a few things by choosing more flexible kernels with. So you can work on this. Yeah.
This may be actually be coming down the road in your slides, so just technically, but if we apply this for hyperparameter tuning, it's a bunch of combinations of hyperparameters, and if that's the case, then if we add that to the fact that maybe the loss function can be really approximated by a Gaussian process, then how good is this when compared to a regular random search?
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff. So what happens if we have more parameters than one? Is that the first question?
If we have a large hyperparameter space like for deep learning, for example, with the number of layers and everything that comes.
Okay, so Bayesian optimization, I think, works reasonably well until you hit like 10 to 20 parameters. So you can go to more than 1D. I'm just showing pictures in 1D. If you have 100 parameters, then we need to think carefully, but there is work by Frank Hutter's group in Freiburg. They don't use Gaussian processes, they use, I think, random forests, and they have optimized up to like 70 or 80 parameters. And so there is, you can do something. And also, like, there's also work on projecting from like 1,000 or million dimensional parameter spaces down to 10, because sometimes you over parameterize things, and then, but if you have 1,000 hyperparameters to set, then yeah, that's hard, independent of what you do. Yeah. Okay. And so I want to come back to the question of where to evaluate next. I may be skipping a few slides because I want to end with something nice. So now assume we have these observations here, these 4 observations, and my current optimum is this, this point here where the cross is. So I can now sample from my Gaussian process, and I can generate a bunch of functions here. And you can see that some of these sampled functions are kind of like have better function values or lower function values in this cross. And so if you do this more often, so these are 1,000 samples from the Gaussian process, I can compute the expected improvement, or I can compute how much better I am on expectation, better than this black line, which is the best or the minimum value that I've found so far. And then I'm plotting this in this graph here. So this is like the corresponding acquisition function that tells me the expected improvement over the best seen point that I have so far. And now I can choose the maximum of this acquisition function, which would be this point here. And I would now suggest I should evaluate my true objective function at this point. So, oops. Okay. Yeah, so this panel here is the expected improvement over the best solution so far, and then I would evaluate my expensive function at the point where my expected improvement is the highest. So there are a few acquisition functions that we can compute in closed form. There are also other acquisition functions, but I just want to briefly go through 3 of them. So if we define this. If we define this quantity here, gamma of x is the best value minus the mean prediction of the Gaussian process divided by the standard deviation, so similar to a z-score, we can compute something called the probability of improvement, so the probability that you get something better, which is the cumulative density function of the Gaussian evaluated at this gamma value. We can compute the expected improvement, so the thing that I just showed you in like pictures, using this rather lengthy equation, or we can compute something as the lower confidence bound, where we only look at the mean prediction of the Gaussian process and we subtract something that is like, this is kappa times the standard deviation. So that's kind of like what I said earlier, which we're going to look at the lower bar of the lower shaded area. So you would that would be the lower confidence bound. So the probability of improvement is, the idea is to determine the probability that x star leads to a better function value than the one that we have seen so far. And if we think of this as from a sampling perspective, right, so we can sample functions, and every time the function goes below this black bar, we count 1. Right, so we count 1. That's what this one says, right? So we count 1 if the function value at x of the sampled value is smaller than the best value we have seen so far. If we have n samples and we divide by n, that's the probability of improvement. And if you do this infinitely often, you get the equation or the formula from the previous slide. Here's an example of how this works. The function we want to optimize is this red function. So it looks horrible. We have two observations, which are these ones over here. We train our Gaussian process on these observations, and that one would be the corresponding GP fit. And this is now the probability of improvement acquisition function, and this diamond is indicating where we should be evaluating next, so because this hits now the maximum value. So now Bayesian optimization works. We evaluate, and the true minimum is here. So we evaluate here, update our GP, and then also our probability of improvement changes, and then we can continue doing this a few times. At some point, so it was very happy around here, and now it decided that it knows a lot about this area, and now it's going to explore somewhere else, right? So this is how the exploration works, and at some point it will find the right answer, right? So now it's still exploring, but this is kind of the idea of probability of improvement, and you can see that the true function is actually very badly modeled in most parts of the parameter space, but in the interesting areas we have a pretty good fit. So expected improvement really is instead of like computing the probability of getting a better function value, we want to quantify how much we get better. Yeah? Instead of if we get probability of improvement would count 1 if we get 10 to the minus 5 better or 5 better. So it would give you a count of 1 for both of these cases. And expected improvement computes the magnitude or expected magnitude of improvement. And yeah, so I don't want to go through this equation here, and also for the lower confidence bound, the equation is here because I want to finish with something slightly different. So the thing that we need to do, what I haven't really said, is how do we find the optimum or the maximum of this acquisition function? As I said, we need to maximize the acquisition function, but how do we do that? Well, so in order to do this, theoretically, we need to run a global optimizer to optimize the acquisition function. So that kind of like sounds maybe a bit silly, because why don't we just do global optimization directly on our function that we're actually interested in? Any ideas? So what have we gained?
Well, the black box was much more complex than the desired function.
All right, so the black box was much more expensive to evaluate, right? So I don't have to pay $10 every time I evaluate the acquisition function. So let's say if computations are cheap, then this global optimizer on the acquisition function is relatively cheap compared to running a global optimizer on the true objective function. So that's the thing. Really the key point here is that we don't have to work with the true objective function if we want to optimize the acquisition function. Yeah, and so now Bayesian optimization is a very general framework. Right? So you want to optimize a black box function in a few experiments, and so it has a wide range of applications. So Netflix uses this for optimizing hyperparameters for the movie recommendations. You can use it for geostatistics, for finding the best resources. AlphaGo has used Bayesian optimization for finding hyperparameters of their algorithm. And as Aisha said yesterday, there's also been work on preventing malaria or spreading of malaria using Bayesian optimization to find a good compromise between spraying and net distribution. So there are actually a lot of practical applications of Bayesian optimization. So there are limitations, right? So it's not the thing that solves all of your problems or my problems. So getting the function class or the model class wrong can be catastrophic. So that's a point that was raised earlier. So what happens if we can't model these things properly? So then, you know, everything can happen. And we also have limited scalability in the number of dimensions or evaluations of the true objective function. So so I said earlier, 10, 20 parameters you may be able to do. What's the problem? Why can't we do 50 parameters or 100 parameters or 1,000 parameters?
So I think, first of all, the time complexity scales cubically with the number of dimensions. So it gets quite expensive to learn Gaussian processes, and then it's not parallelizable. You need to wait before you can set one parameters.
Okay, so there are two things. One thing is that, so we haven't discussed this, but Gaussian processes scale cubically in the number of data points, not dimensions, number of data points. And if we have high dimensions, then we know in order to understand something about the function in 1,000 dimensions, even if we evaluate the function 1,000 times, we know not much about the function. Right, so we need to evaluate, in many dimensions, we need to evaluate the function much more often, and that will cause the problem with scalability of the Gaussian process. But also, if it's really expensive to evaluate this function, then you can't afford it anymore. So that's one of the things. And the second point, what was your second point?
It's not parallelizable.
Right, so there's actually work on parallel Bayesian optimization, but you have to think about it and need to predict what happens when one of the jobs finishes and so on. So that's more complicated, but it's definitely a challenge. Yeah, so the key thing is that the Gaussian process, actually the training is actually fine. The problem is that for evaluating the acquisition function, we need to make a prediction. Prediction scales quadratically in the number of data points. And if we run a global optimizer, we have to evaluate this thing many, many, many times. So the computational bottleneck is not so much training the Gaussian process, but it is more like when we optimize the acquisition function. So if we have to evaluate, even in this 1D case, if you do just a simple grid search, with like 1,000 evaluations between -10 and +10, then you have to do 1,000 predictions, and then, but in higher dimensions, then you have to do a lot of work. It's very, very difficult. So the two reasons why this doesn't work that well. And so what I wanted to do last is I want to show you some applications, some different applications of Bayesian optimization. So here, this is work by Antoine Cully from 2015. That was a Nature paper on building, or making robots learn if they got damaged. So they were inspired by a dog that learned to walk with 3 legs. The dog had an accident, got an amputation, so only 3 legs left, but the dog's still running around after the ball. And the question is, can you do this with a robot as well? So what you can do is you take the robot and you break its leg. I mean, it's similar to here, right? And so what they managed to do is, after using Bayesian optimization, after 3 trials, they actually managed to compensate the behavior, or compensate that leg that is missing or was broken, and the robot was walking pretty much at the same speed as before. So this is something you can do with Bayesian optimization. So the black box function here is you can evaluate or measure the speed of the robot with a missing leg. And then you can start optimizing the parameters of the robot controller in order to maximize this speed. So that's one thing you can use Bayesian optimization for. Then another piece of work is something that we did in 2015. Again, like in robotics, here the idea was we have a bipedal robot. So they, 2 legs, they fall very quickly. And you know, if a robot falls, then it usually gets some damage. So what you want to do is you want to minimize the number of number of times the robot falls. And at the same time, we want to maximize the walking speed and the robustness to, let's say, initial settings or some noise. There were 8 parameters in the controller, so this is like an 8-dimensional parameter space that we use, and then we use Bayesian optimization for optimizing those parameters. And so the objective function that we use, so this G function, is the length of the walk in, I think, 12 seconds. So we took a tape measure and effectively measured how far the robot walked on an average of 3 trials. So that got the robustness. So we ran it from 3 configurations. Let me see whether this works here. Okay, this is fine. And this is kind of like an example video of like how this worked. So in the early stages of optimization, the experiments look like this. Right? So it makes one step and then it falls. And then after about 20 experiments, you can see it's a bit wobbly, but kind of like gets the idea. And then it hits the ground. So every time this happens, there could be some damage to the motors or some other parts of the robot. And then after about, I think 80 experiments, we got a walking behavior that looked like this, and it was walking for 2 or 3 minutes in a circle before something happened. So you can do this with Bayesian optimization. So Roberto, who did the work here, was, I'll just play this again. He first spent 2 weeks in the lab for manual tuning of the parameters. I mean, that's what you do. And then he came back and said, okay, I got it to walk. It looked like this. It was like limping. And it's like, okay, and I'm done. I'm no longer doing robotics. This is too painful. And I said, okay, why don't we have a look at this Bayesian optimization stuff? Because that's exactly a situation where we can use Bayesian optimization. We want to minimize the number of trials, and we want to get something that actually works. And so these 45 centimeters per second is, I think it's the limit of the hardware. So you can't get faster. So the reason why I'm saying this is that we got in touch with a person who built the robot during his PhD and also designed the controller, and he said this is pretty much what he got out of the robot during his PhD. So this is I think is nice. So we found good parameters after about 100 experiments, and we also got a speed up in terms of like finding, not only like automating the search for parameters, but also finding good parameters. So we were down from 1 week of like really tedious work in the lab to 6 hours. So this is a substantial speed up in terms of finding good parameters. Okay, so there are a bunch of like further topics in Bayesian optimization, so nothing really I have mentioned today. So there are other acquisition functions. There's also non-myopic Bayesian optimization, so where you look at not only like one-step prediction or one-step optimization, like where should I evaluate next, but where should I evaluate next, and then next, and next. This is gonna it's very complicated. There's high-dimensional Bayesian optimization, large-scale Bayesian optimization. So this is the work that Frank Hutter does in Freiburg. There's an efficient way of like optimizing acquisition functions with exploiting submodularity and gradients and all this kind of stuff. Bayesian optimization without Gaussian processes. Again, this is the work by Frank Hutter. Dealing with constraints, automated machine learning, and then also multitasking, parallelizing, resource allocation, multi-fidelity observations. So there's a lot of work on on Bayesian optimization on all of those topics. There's also software in various frameworks, and to summarize, what we wanted to look at is a method for global optimization of black box functions that are expensive to evaluate. We can think of here of like all the meta challenges in machine learning or automated machine learning. And really the key idea here was to use a probabilistic proxy model, so the Gaussian process in our case, which is cheap to evaluate, and use this proxy model to suggest where to evaluate next. Yeah? And the acquisition function trades off this issue of exploration and exploitation. So this is really the key ideas behind Bayesian optimization. So I think that's it for today. We're good on time, so yeah, thank you. If you have more questions, then please go ahead, and then we'll sort this out. Thanks. Difference. Yes, it does. So for continuous hyperparameters, you can do the nice interpolation. You can, and for discrete, this doesn't quite work. So for discrete, you need to look into the bandit literature or multi-armed bandits. Then you will find the corresponding part that